Frank Johnson never imagined the first crack in his family would start with something as small as a beer. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, in his suburban Ohio home, he returned from the grocery store, 2 heavy paper bags digging into his hands, to find his son-in-law, Dave Thompson, lounging in Frank's favorite recliner. That chair wasn't just furniture. It was the last gift from his late wife, Linda, before cancer took her. Dave, eyes glued to the TV, didn't even glance up. "Grab me a cold beer while you're up," he said, as if giving orders to a waiter. Frank set the groceries down, the weight of the moment hitting him harder than the milk and bread in his hands. "Excuse me?" he asked. Dave smirked, clarifying Corona. "Not that cheap stuff you drink." Before Frank could respond, his daughter, Melissa, blonde hair, pulled into a messy ponytail, walked in from the kitchen. She took in the scene, then sided with her husband. "Dad, just get him the beer. It's not worth a fight." But Dave wasn't done. He stepped closer, towering over Frank. "Here's how it's going to work," he said. "You live in our house, you follow my rules." Melissa's voice was steady when she delivered the ultimatum. "Either you do what Dave says, or you can pack your things and leave." Frank's answer was quiet, but it changed everything. "I'll pack." Frank didn't slam the bedroom door or yell back. It wasn't his style. Instead, he walked down the familiar hallway, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors he and Linda had refinished together more than 20 years earlier. In his bedroom closet, an old navy blue suitcase sat on the top shelf, gathering dust. He pulled it down gently, almost reverently. It was the same one he and Linda had used. On their honeymoon to Yellowstone, he laid it open on the bed, its empty interior gaping like a question. As he folded his shirts and rolled his socks, his mind traveled through the years, each memory sharper than the last. He thought of Melissa's college years, for years at a private university in Pennsylvania. That cost him over $160,000. She had insisted a state school just wasn't the right fit, and Frank, wanting the best for his only child, had agreed. He'd worked extra hours at the local bank, reviewing loan applications late into the night, his hands cramping from the paperwork. Then came her wedding, a picture-perfect June day, with a white tent on the lawn. Flowers imported from out of state, and a champagne fountain guests still talked about. The bill came to nearly $25,000. Dave's family couldn't contribute, so Frank quietly covered their share. When the newlyweds dreamed of owning a home, but didn't have the down payment, Frank wrote a check for $85,000 from his retirement savings. He told himself it was a starter boost, the kind of help any loving father would give. And when the bills started piling up, he stepped in again, $1,200 each month for the mortgage, $350 for utilities, $500 for groceries when things got tight, even covering their car insurance for both vehicles. All of it, month after month, came from his modest Social Security check and a small pension. He skipped vacations, drove the same 15-year-old Buick, and gave up little luxuries like dinners out, all so Melissa and Dave could live comfortably now. Standing in his own bedroom, packing under the weight of their ultimatum, he realized the truth. Those years of sacrifice hadn't built gratitude. They'd built entitlement. From the living room came muffled whispers, Dave's low, irritated tone, and Melissa's softer voice. They were no doubt discussing how the old man was overreacting. Frank kept packing, each folded shirt a quiet declaration. This ends now. He placed a framed photo of Linda in the side pocket of the suitcase, wrapped in tissue to keep it safe. Her warm smile looked back at him, as if giving silent approval. His medications went into the front pouch, along with his reading glasses and the small leather journal where he tracked every expense, a habit from his 30 years in banking. When Frank wheeled the suitcase down the hallway, the conversation in the living room stopped abruptly. Dave sat in the recliner again, but there was a stiffness in his posture now. Melissa stood near the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. No one said goodbye. The Buick started. On the first try, and Frank backed out of the driveway without glancing at the house. The 30-minute drive to the Pine View Motel gave him time to think. He passed familiar landmarks, the diner where he and Linda used to split a slice of apple pie, The park where he had taught Melissa to ride her bike, the hardware store, where he'd picked up tools for weekend projects. Each memory was bittersweet now. The motel was small but clean, with a faded neon sign that buzzed faintly in the cool evening air. Inside, the room smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner. A single bed, a small table by the window, and a dresser, not much, but it was his, and for the first time in years. So was his independence. Frank sat on the edge of the bed, pulled out his laptop, and opened his bank accounts. Numbers glowed on the screen, each one representing a lifetime of discipline and self-denial. He stared at them for a long moment, then made his first decision. The mortgage payment stops tomorrow. That night, as he lay in the unfamiliar bed, Frank felt no regret, only resolve. Tomorrow, he would start reclaiming more than just his money. He would reclaim his dignity. The next morning, Frank woke before sunrise. Years of early banking hours had trained him to be up before the world stirred, and the quiet still suited him. The motel's thin curtains glowed faintly with the first light, and outside, the parking lot was silent except for the occasional hum of a passing car en route. 14, he made himself the motel's complimentary coffee week, but hot, and sat at the small table by the window. His leather expense journal lay open beside his laptop, each page lined with neat columns and dates. Last night's decision about the mortgage payment was just the beginning. If he was going to take back control, he'd have to sever every financial tie Melissa and Dave had to him. Frank started with the mortgage, called First Community Bank, where the payment had been drafted automatically for years. The young representative on the other end read from her script, polite but cautious. "Mr. Johnson, this account has been active for 60 months. Are you sure you want to cancel?" "I'm sure," Frank said. "The homeowners no longer qualify for my assistance." Next was the auto insurance. He'd been covering Melissa's Honda and Dave's Silverado for nearly 3 years under his policy. That was $280 a month for vehicles he didn't drive, ensuring accidents he would never cause. The agent removed both vehicles and recalculated his premium, which dropped by nearly half. Then came the credit cards. Melissa had been an authorized user on 3 of his accounts: Visa, MasterCard, and the Warehouse Club store card. It wasn't unusual for him to find charges he didn't recognize: restaurant meals, designer clothes, electronics. Over time, it had added up to hundreds each month. "Remove her immediately," he told the Visa rep. "Any existing balance is mine, but there will be no new charges." Frank felt lighter with each call, as though invisible weights were sliding off his shoulders. 30 years in banking had taught him the language of policies, cancellation, procedures, and legal rights. He wasn't doing anything out of anger. Everything was measured, deliberate, and well within the law. Life insurance was next. His $100,000 policy had named Melissa as the sole beneficiary for years, a decision he'd made after Linda's passing to make sure their daughter was secure. But now, that money would serve a greater purpose. Frank requested the forms too. Change the beneficiary to the Ohio Veterans Housing Initiative, an organization he respected deeply. By mid-morning, he had 8 confirmation numbers written neatly in his journal. They weren't just proof of canceled payments and closed access. They were the first tangible steps toward freedom. He looked around the modest motel room and realized that, for the first time in years, every dollar in his account was truly his. The phone stayed silent that morning. Melissa and Dave hadn't noticed yet. They probably wouldn't until the first mortgage payment failed or the car insurance lapsed. Frank could almost hear the future arguments, the confusion, then the anger. But he felt no guilt. After lunch at the diner down the street, Frank walked through town, past the brickfront library and the old movie theater with its sun-faded marquee. He knew word would eventually get around. In small-town Ohio, it always did. That was fine by him. The truth had a way of traveling on its own. Back at the motel, he organized his paperwork again, setting aside a file labeled evidence. Inside were copies of bank statements, insurance policies, credit card records, and now the confirmation numbers from today's calls. If Melissa or Dave tried to twist the story, Frank would have facts, not emotions, on his side. That night, he sat on the bed and studied the photo of Linda. He imagined her reaction to what had happened over the past 24 hours. She'd always been the gentle one, the peacemaker, but she had also known the value of self-respect. "You did the right thing, Frank," he could almost hear her say. "It's about time." The motel's neon sign buzzed faintly outside as Frank turned off the light. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring. Maybe silence, maybe confrontation. But for the first time in years, the direction of his life was firmly back in his own hands. The following afternoon, Frank decided to take his coffee at the Main Street Diner. The one place in town where you could still get a bottomless cup for $1.50 and a side of conversation for free. It was early enough that the breakfast crowd had cleared out, and the place had that comfortable hush that came after the rush. He slid into his usual corner booth, the one where Linda used to meet him after her doctor's appointments. He was halfway through his second cup when a familiar voice broke the quiet. "Frank Johnson. Well, I'll be damned." Frank looked up to see Bill Hansen, his old colleague from First Community Bank. They had worked together for nearly 15 years before. Bill transferred to the main branch in Columbus. Bill, now in his 70s but still with the same firm handshake, slid into the seat across from him. "I heard you've been staying out at that motel on Route 14, Bill said, studying him carefully. "Everything all right?" Frank took a measured sip of coffee. Family situation. Needed a little space. Bill nodded slowly, then leaned in, lowering his voice. "Frank, I need to tell you something. A few months back, your son-in-law, Dave, came into the bank asking for a home equity loan. $50,000. Frank frowned. "On his house." Bill's expression hardened. "No, Frank, on your house." He brought in paperwork, claiming he owned it. Documentation that looked official at first glance. We ran a title search. Everything came back in your name, clean as a whistle. No cosigners, no liens. Nothing that would give him any claim. Those documents he brought in, forged? For a moment, Frank just stared at him. "When was this?" "Late December, maybe early January. I handled it personally because of the amount." We denied it immediately and flagged his file. Technically, since no money changed hands, it's a gray area legally. But I kept copies of everything. Frank, this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate fraud. The diner's background noise faded in Frank's ears as the implications settled over him. Dave hadn't just been an entitled house guest. He had been planning to steal from him months before the beer incident. This wasn't desperation from recent events. It was a long game. Bill cleared his throat. "You want to know what he put down as the reason for the loan? Home improvements. But between you and me, word around town is he's got gambling debts. Pretty substantial ones." Frank's jaw tightened. "How substantial? You remember Jim Crawford, detective now?" He mentioned Dave's irregular. "At Lakeshore Casino? High-stakes poker." "If you want details, Jim's your guy." Frank set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Bill, I appreciate you telling me this." Bill's eyes narrowed. Be careful, Frank. A man who forges documents to steal from family doesn't stop there. Desperation makes people dangerous." The walk back to the motel felt longer than usual. The early spring air bit at his cheeks. But it wasn't the cold that had him tense. It was the realization that Dave's disrespect that Saturday afternoon was never about a beer. It was about control, about keeping Frank compliant, so the plan could keep moving forward. Back in his room, Frank opened his laptop and created a new folder on his desktop. Dave Thompson, evidence. Bill's revelation was just the first entry. Typed out the details while they were fresh dates, amounts, forged loan attempt, gambling rumors, and made a note to follow up with Detective Crawford. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the motel heater. But Frank's thoughts were anything but still. He'd spent weeks thinking this was a matter of respect and boundaries. Now he saw it for what it was, a calculated attempt to strip him of everything he'd worked for. The difference between a petty freeloader and a con man, Frank thought, was the paperwork. Dave had crossed that line months ago. Tomorrow he would find Jim Crawford. And when he did, the truth about Dave's debts and just how far his son-in-law was willing to go would no longer be rumor. It would be evidence. The next morning, Frank didn't waste time. He'd had a restless night, his mind circling Bill Hansen's revelation like a dog pacing the fence line. Dave hadn't just been rude or entitled. He had been running a scheme. Frank wasn't about to sit back and let him try again. By 8:30 a.m., Frank was standing on the marble steps of the Fairfield County Courthouse, the early sun glinting off the flagpole out front. The building had always seemed imposing when he was younger, but today, it felt like an ally. Inside, the clerk's office smelled faintly of paper and coffee. A middle-aged woman with glasses perched low on her nose looked up from her computer. "Can I help you, sir?" "Yes, ma'am," Frank said, sliding a manila envelope across the counter. "I'm here to file an eviction notice." She took the envelope, opened it, and began flipping through the documents, the property deed. With Frank's name printed clearly, the typed eviction form, a short statement outlining the reasons. "Mr. Johnson, you understand this is your daughter's residence?" she asked, glancing up at him. "I do, and it's also my property. They violated the terms of our verbal agreement, mutual respect and contribution to household expenses. Both have been breached." Her eyes flicked over the deed again. "Everything's in order. 30-day notice period starts today. If they contest, we'll schedule a hearing. Otherwise, the sheriff's department will serve final papers after." The deadline. "How soon will they get this?" Frank asked. "Sheriff usually handles service within 48 hours. She stamped the papers with a loud, decisive thump. "You'll get a copy for your records." Frank thanked her, slid the papers back into the envelope, and walked out into the crisp March air, feeling a little taller. For the first time since leaving his house, he had legal weight behind him, but he wasn't done. The Fairfield Police Department was just a few blocks away. Frank made the walk, his boots crunching on leftover road salt from the winter storms. Inside, he was directed to the back, where Detective Jim Crawford's cramped office sat wedged between two filing cabinets. Crawford looked up from a stack of paperwork and broke into a grin. "Frank Johnson, now there's a face I haven't seen in too long. What brings you in?" Frank closed the door behind him and got straight to the point. "I need information about Dave Thompson's gambling." Crawford leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "Your soon-in-law. What's this about?" Frank laid out the entire chain of events, the beer demand, the ultimatum, moving out, cutting off the finances. Bill Hansen's story about the forged loan documents. Crawford didn't interrupt, just jotted notes in a spiral-bound pad. When Frank finished, the detective tapped his pen against the paper. Well, Bill wasn't wrong. Dave's a regular at Lakeshore Casino. Poker tables. Mostly, but lately, he's been playing higher stakes than usual. According to some creditors we've heard from, he owes somewhere between 18 and 20 grand. Frank shook his head. $18,000. Crawford's tone was matter-of-fact, but edged with warning. "It's a mix of legitimate lenders and guys you don't want to owe money to. The legitimate ones will go through the courts. The others, you let the sentence trail off. I'd guess he's got maybe a couple of months before things get ugly." Frank sat quietly for a moment, absorbing it all. The gambling, the debts, the attempted fraud, the disrespect in his own home. It wasn't just personal anymore. Dave was a financial and legal hazard, Jim. "I'm going to need a copy of whatever you've got on his creditors," Frank said. "I can give you what's public record," Crawford replied. "But Frank, be careful. When a guy like Dave feels cornered, he doesn't get reasonable. He gets reckless." "I understand," Frank said, standing. "That's why I'm getting ahead of him." When Frank stepped back into the sunlight, the courthouse and police station behind him, he felt the first flicker of something he hadn't felt in weeks. Control. The kind of control that comes when you stop reacting and start planning. He walked back to the motel, pulled out his laptop, and created a new document titled Action Plan. At the top, in neat block letters, he wrote, "Eviction filed awaiting. Service, legal evidence of gambling debts, Detective Crawford. Creditors, verify false address and no property ownership. For Frank Johnson." This was no longer about getting out of his daughter's house with his dignity intact. This was about making sure Dave Thompson never had the chance to take from him again. Not a dollar, not a brick, not a shred of peace. By Friday morning, Frank knew it was time to move beyond paperwork and private files. Dave might have been sloppy with money, but he was clever with words, and in a small Ohio town like Fairfield, stories could spread faster than facts if you didn't get ahead of them. Frank's plan wasn't to stand on a street corner shouting his side. That wasn't his style. Instead, he would speak with a few key people, the kind whose voices carry through coffee shops, hardware store aisles, and after-church conversations. His first stop was the post office. As he fed a stack of letters into the drop box, he heard the unmistakable voice of Martha Henderson, fellow parishioner at St. Andrew's and an unofficial town information hub. She spotted him immediately. "Frank, dear, I've been hearing troubling things," she said, lowering her voice in that way people do when they're about to raise eyebrows. "Is everything all right at home?" Frank kept his tone even. "Alyssa!" "And Dave asked me to move out, so I did." "Sometimes adult children need to manage their own responsibilities." Her brows shot up. "They asked you to leave your own house. But you paid for their wedding, and didn't you help with the down payment?" "I did. And the mortgage. And groceries when needed. But I think it's time they stand on their own 2 feet. That was all Martha needed." Frank didn't have to embellish. She would carry the truth with just the right amount of emphasis. And by Sunday, half the congregation would know next. Frank walked to Miller's Hardware, where he had worked part-time after retiring from the bank. Tom Miller, the owner, was behind the counter, flanked by 2 employees. "Frank, we heard you're staying at the Pineview Motel," Tom said, frowning. "What happened?" Frank told them the simple version. 5 years of financial support. An ultimatum from Dave, and his decision to leave. He didn't have to mention the forged loan attempt, not yet. The reaction was immediate. Dave, it seemed, had told people he was helping Frank with the mortgage. That lie unraveled fast when Frank explained the truth. "You mean you paid for their mortgage?" one of the clerks said, shaking his head. "Every month, along with their utilities and insurance." That explains why Dave always turned down. "Extra shifts?" Tom muttered. "We figured he just didn't need the money." "Maybe he didn't," Frank said quietly, "as long as my checks kept coming." By the time he left the hardware store, Frank knew the truth would ripple through town before dinner. His third stop was St. Andrew's, where Pastor Williams was in his office preparing for Sunday's sermon. The pastor gestured him inside, his expression warm but concerned. "Several people have mentioned they're worried about you. Can you help me understand what's going on?" Frank laid it out simply. The years of support, the ultimatum, and his choice to walk away rather than live under Dave's rules. Pastor Williams listened intently, nodding. "Sometimes love means allowing people to face the consequences of their choices. It sounds like you've been protecting them from those consequences for a long time." "It's too long," Frank agreed. Walking back to the motel, Frank stopped for coffee at Annie's Cafe. Yes. The place was busy, the air thick with chatter. As he sat at a small table in the corner, snippets of conversation drifted over. "Did you hear Dave's been owing money all over town? Frank's been paying their bills for years?" Makes you wonder. It was working. Not through malice, but through clarity. The truth was taking root that evening. His phone rang. It was Mrs. Patterson, his neighbor for 20 years. "Frank, there's been shouting at the house. Mostly Dave, but Melissa too. The sheriff drove by twice yesterday." Frank thanked her for watching out for the place. When he hung up, he realized something. He didn't have to chase this fight anymore. The legal system was in motion, and the town was starting to see Dave for who he really was. All Frank had to do now was stay steady, let the truth keep spreading, and be ready when the next move came. He poured himself a cup of motel coffee, sat down with his journal, and wrote one sentence under today's date, narrative shifting in my favor. Maintained course by Wednesday morning, Frank decided it was time to speak to Melissa face to face. Not in the chaos of her living room with Dave hovering nearby, but in a place where the conversation could be clean, quiet, and unavoidable. He called. Her cell. "Melissa, I want to meet. Just you. Dot. I can't leave Dave alone right now, Dad, she said, her voice taut. He's struggling with everything that's going on. Then we have nothing to discuss. You know, I have a restraining order against him. It means we can't be in the same place. There was a long pause, then a sigh. Where and when? Main Street Diner, 2 o'clock, back corner booth. Frank arrived 15 minutes early, ordered coffee, and chose the booth facing away. From the street, he didn't want her attention wandering every time someone walked past the window. When Melissa arrived, she looked older than her 28 years. Her eyes were shadowed, her hands restless on the strap of her purse. She slid into the booth. Dad, I know you're angry, but you've left us in a mess. The phone won't stop ringing. People are showing up at the door asking about money. We can't keep up. Frank listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set his cup down. Melissa, I'm offering you one chance to walk away from this with some dignity. Her brows knit. What do you mean? Public acknowledgement of the truth. At church this Sunday, in the Fairfield Tribune, and on Facebook, you tell people exactly what I've done for you and Dave over the last 5 years. The tuition, the wedding, the mortgage payments. And you tell them why I left. Her face flushed. You want me to humiliate myself in front of the whole town? I want you to tell the truth. There's a difference. Right now, Dave's been painting me as some senile old man who abandoned his pregnant daughter. People deserve to know what really happened. Melissa hesitated. And if I do? This? What about the house? Frank leaned back, his voice calm but firm. It's already decided. The house will be donated to the Ohio Veterans Housing Initiative. 3 veteran families will live there. It's not coming back to you, no matter what you say or do. Eyes widened. Why would you do that? Because I want any reconciliation between us to be about love and respect, not inheritance. For 5 years, you've treated me like a bank account with legs. I need to know if there's anything between us beyond money. Tears welled in her eyes, but Frank had learned to tell the difference between genuine and practiced emotion. What if I can't do it? She asked quietly. Then you live with the consequences. Dave will probably skip town to avoid his creditors. You can go with him and keep pretending, or you can stay here and rebuild your life honestly. But if you choose him, you choose losing me. Melissa swallowed hard. If I do what you're asking, could we ever have a real relationship again? Forgiveness? And trust are different things, Frank said. I forgave you the day I left, but trust has to be earned back, one action at a time. The silence between them stretched. Melissa finally nodded, though her eyes stayed on her coffee cup. Long do I have? Sunday morning, 10 o'clock. St. Andrews. If you're not there to tell the truth, I'll know you've made your choice. When she stood to leave, her shoulders sagged under the weight of the decision. Frank watched her walk out, her figure shrinking. In the diner's front window, back at his booth, he topped off his coffee and made a note in his journal. Ultimatum given, truth or comfort. Clock is ticking. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear. The kind of early spring day when Fairfield's church bells carried 4 blocks. Frank sat in his Buick outside St. Andrews for a moment before going in. He didn't know if Melissa would show, and if she did, he didn't know whether she'd follow through. But he'd made his peace with either outcome. Inside, the sanctuary was fuller than usual. Word had gotten around about some kind of family announcement. And in a small town, curiosity could fill pews faster than a holiday service. Frank took his usual seat 3 rows from the front. Center aisle, his leather-bound Bible on his lap, coffee still faintly on his breath. The service began with familiar hymns and scripture readings. Frank sang, but his mind was half on the pulpit and half on the door at the back. Then, during testimony time, he saw her. Melissa stood from a pew near the rear, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands, walked slowly down the center aisle, every step echoing in the silence. By the time she reached the podium, could have heard a pin drop. She gripped the edges of the lectern and took a deep breath. I need to tell you all something important about my father, she began, her voice stronger than Frank expected. For the past 5 years, Dad has been supporting my husband, Dave, and me financially. He paid over $160,000 for my college education, even though I could have gone to a state school. He paid $25,000 for my wedding when Dave's family couldn't contribute. When we bought our house, he gave us $85,000 for the down payment. And when we couldn't make the mortgage, he paid it every single month. He paid for our groceries, our utilities, and even our car insurance. All of it while living on Social Security and his pension. Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Frank sat still, his eyes on her, watching as she pressed on. 3 weeks ago, Lissa continued, when my father refused to follow my husband's orders like a servant, we gave him an ultimatum: obey Dave or leave his own house. Dad chose to leave, and I stood by and let it happen. I chose loyalty to my husband over loyalty to the man who raised me with love and patience. That was wrong. Her voice wavered, but she kept going. I let my husband disrespect my father in his own home. I let my pride blind me to the truth. I let the man who sacrificed so much for me walk away without a fight. I am here today because my father gave me one last chance to choose truth over pride. So here it is. Dad, I was wrong. Dave was wrong. And I'm sorry isn't enough for what we put you through. But I hope it's a start. For a long moment after she stepped back from the microphone, no one moved. Then the pastor stood, visibly moved. Sometimes the hardest courage is admitting our mistakes publicly, Pastor Williams said. Melissa has shown that courage today, and her father has shown us what dignity looks like under pressure. After the service, people approached, Frank with handshakes, hugs, and quiet words of support. Mrs. Henderson clasped his hand. We all knew you were helping them, Frank, but we didn't know the half of it. It took a lot for her to say that up there. Tom Miller from the hardware store clapped him on the shoulder. Boundaries aren't easy when it's family. Good on you for holding the line. Frank stepped outside into the bright sunlight just as Melissa walked up. Her eyes were still red, but her voice was steady. The letter to the Tribune will run Wednesday. The Facebook post goes up tonight. She hesitated, then added Dave. Left town yesterday while I was at work. Took his truck and a duffel bag. No note, no call. Frank wasn't surprised. Men like him don't face consequences. They run from them. I filed for divorce this morning, Melissa said quietly. Found out he'd been using my credit cards for gambling. The debts are worse than we thought. Frank studied her for a moment, then nodded. One step at a time. For the first time in weeks, he felt the tightness in his chest ease. She'd told the truth, and in a town like Fairfield, that meant everything. 2 days after the Sunday service, Frank was in his motel room sorting through a cardboard box marked important. Inside were years' worth of property records, bank statements, and letters, some typed, some in Linda's delicate handwriting. He had one last loose end to tie up before closing this chapter for good. The envelope from the Lisbon law firm lay on top, its contents already familiar, but no less powerful in his hands. The deed to a villa in Algarve, Portugal, Linda's name in elegant script, and a letter she'd written before her passing. Frank read it again, her voice echoing in his mind. If you're reading this, it means you've outlived me, and maybe outlived some of the illusions. About our children, they may try to take from you. Don't let them. The villa is yours now. If life here becomes unbearable, you have somewhere to go where you can start fresh. Use it as an escape plan, or simply as a reminder that you are never trapped. The words hit differently now, after everything that had unfolded. Linda had known. She'd seen the seeds of entitlement long before Frank wanted to admit they were there. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, Melissa stood there, holding a small duffel bag. She looked exhausted, but calmer than she had in weeks. I brought you something, she said, handing over a worn leather folder. Inside were all of Dave's remaining personal items from the house, old IDs, business cards, a few photographs. I don't want anything of his left in my life. I also called his creditors and told them he no longer lives at the address. Sheriff's Department has a file now. Frank nodded. You're closing the door, slamming it, she said with a faint smile. And I spoke with the attorney about transferring the house to the Veterans Housing Initiative like you planned. The paperwork's ready whenever you are. The following week, Frank sat in a conference room at the attorney's office, signing the final documents. The house on Maple Street, the home he and Linda had built over 25 years, would soon be divided into 3 apartments for veterans. In need, the thought filled him with a deep, steady pride. This wasn't about taking something from Melissa. It was about putting something good into the world. When the last page was signed, Frank slipped the keys into a plain white envelope. "Deliver these to the program director. Tell them it's from Linda and Frank Johnson." That evening, back at the motel, he began sorting his own possessions into 3 piles on the bed. Go, stay, travel, and go were the things that would go. Into storage. Day. It was a short list, mostly clothes and small personal items he could leave behind. Travel was the lightest pile. A passport, a few changes of clothes, his laptop, and the photo of Linda from their 40th anniversary. He picked up his phone and called Anna, the caretaker of the villa in Portugal. "Anna, it's Frank, I think." "I'm ready to see the place." Her voice was warm, reassuring. "It's been waiting for you, Mr. Johnson. I'll have everything ready." When he hung up, he wrote one last note in his journal. What they know, what they don't, what I want them to think. The first 2 columns were now almost empty. The third had just one line. Frank Johnson is starting over. Melissa stopped. By later that night, with a small homemade dinner, roast chicken, green beans, and cornbread, they ate together quietly, no long speeches, just the comfort of being in the same room without tension. When she left, she hugged him longer than she had in years. "You'll send me pictures from Portugal?" she asked. "I will," Frank promised. And, for the first time in months, he didn't just believe it, he was looking forward to it. The air in Lisbon was warmer than Frank expected, carrying the scent of salt from the nearby Atlantic. After a long flight and a short drive south, the taxi turned onto a quiet coastal road lined with bougainvillea in full bloom. As they rounded a curve, Frank saw it, the villa Linda had bought in secret, its whitewashed walls glowing in the late afternoon sun. Anna, the caretaker, stood by the front gate, waving. "Mr. Johnson?" she called, her smile bright. "Welcome home." Frank stepped out of the car and onto the gravel drive. For a moment, he just stood there, taking it. In the curved terracotta roof tiles, the tall, arched windows, the sound of waves rolling onto the shore just beyond the garden. Inside, sunlight spilled across cool tile floors. A large wooden table sat in the dining room, worn smooth at the edges, as if waiting for family dinners that had yet to happen. Anna led him out to the terrace. The view stopped him in his tracks. The ocean stretched endlessly, its blues shifting with the wind. Linda's foresight had placed this haven in his life, even when he couldn't see past the struggles at home. That evening, Frank sat on the terrace with a glass of red wine. The sky turned gold, then orange, then deep purple. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear children laughing, the sound carrying on the breeze. The first time in years, his chest felt light. Not because the past was gone, but because he'd finally set it down. He thought about Melissa, about the courage it had taken for her to tell the truth, and the courage it took for him to leave when staying would have been easier. He thought about Linda's letter, how love sometimes meant protecting someone even from their own family. Frank raised his glass toward the horizon. "We made it, Linda," he whispered. "Sometimes the hardest thing you'll ever do is walk. Away from the people you love, not because you've stopped caring, but because staying means losing yourself." Frank's story reminds us that dignity is worth protecting, even at the cost of comfort. Not that it's never too late to start over, whether that's in a small apartment across town or a sunlit villa across the ocean. If Frank's journey touched your heart, share in the comments what starting over would look like for you. Have you ever had to make a choice that hurt in the moment but freed you in the long run? Your story might give someone else the courage they need today. And if you believe in protecting your peace, no matter your age, hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Because here we share the kind of lessons life doesn't teach in school, the ones you carry with you forever.